The morning of August 6th, 1945, began like any other in Hiroshima. The sun rose over a quiet city. School children walked in clusters down the narrow streets. Shopkeepers opened their stalls, and mothers drew water from the wells. The war had dragged on for years, but here, far from the front lines, life carried on with a fragile sense of normalcy. Few could imagine that within hours the city would cease to exist. But while Hiroshima stirred to life, far away on the island of Tinian in the Mariana Islands, a group of men stood beside a gleaming silver aircraft. Its name was painted in neat dark letters along the nose. Enola Gay. Inside the aircraft, behind its polished aluminum skin, rested something the world had never seen before. A weapon that represented not only the height of scientific achievement, but the depths of moral uncertainty. It was a bomb nicknamed Little Boy. What few understood at that moment was that this single device would not only end a war, but begin a new kind of fear. A fear that would define the next century. The men preparing for the flight knew only fragments of the truth. Their commanding officer, Colonel Paul Tibbets, had been briefed on the mission's importance but not its long-term implications. The crew had trained for weeks, told that their success could shorten the war and save countless lives. They didn't yet grasp that they were about to unleash the most destructive force humanity had ever created. Meanwhile, halfway across the Pacific in Washington, D.C., President Harry S. Truman had already made his decision. In the days leading up to this morning, Truman had wrestled with the same haunting question that had divided his advisors. Would using this bomb be an act of necessity or an act of terror? To understand how the world reached this point, we must turn back to the race that began years earlier in the shadow of another war, when scientists first realized that the very building blocks of matter could be split apart. In 1939, as Nazi Germany expanded across Europe, a handful of scientists fled to America, bringing with them a warning and a discovery. Among them was Albert Einstein, whose letter to President Franklin Roosevelt set in motion what became known as the Manhattan Project. This secret endeavor united thousands of minds across the United States, Britain, and Canada. Physicists, engineers, soldiers, and mathematicians worked in hidden desert towns, their work veiled behind fences and code names. Their goal? Build an atomic bomb before Germany could. The race wasn't only scientific, it was existential. Hitler's scientists were already experimenting with uranium. If they succeeded first, the war might be lost before it could be won. At Los Alamos, deep in the New Mexico desert, Robert Oppenheimer, a theoretical physicist with a sharp mind and an even sharper conscience, became the project's scientific director. Around him gathered the greatest scientific talent of the era: Fermi, Feynman, Teller, Lawrence, names that would later define the dawn of the atomic age. They worked under immense pressure, bound by secrecy, isolated from their families, their discoveries shielded even from one another. And yet, as they pieced together equations and blueprints, a quiet dread grew among them. They began to realize what they were creating wasn't just a weapon. It was something capable of annihilating cities. By mid-1945, the war in Europe was over. Nazi Germany had surrendered. But in the Pacific, Japan fought on with unyielding ferocity. Even as their empire crumbled, their resistance only hardened. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had already shown the world how far Japan would go to defend its homeland. American forces had suffered staggering losses, and estimates for an invasion of the Japanese mainland predicted over 1 million Allied casualties and possibly far more Japanese deaths. To Truman, the bomb offered a way to end the war quickly, decisively, without invading Japan. But beneath that logic lay other motives, political and strategic. The Soviet Union had just declared war on Japan and was preparing to invade from the north. The United States wanted the war over before Stalin's forces could claim influence in Asia. Ending it swiftly, with overwhelming power, would send a clear message, not just to Japan, but to the entire world, about America's new status as a superpower. And so, the decision was made. But even in that decision lay unease. Some scientists who had built the bomb begged for a demonstration instead, a test on an uninhabited island, to warn Japan and the world of its power. Others feared such a warning might fail to convince Japan's military government, wasting the bomb's shock value. In the end, Truman chose direct action. The first target would be Hiroshima, a city of about 350,000 people, large enough to show the bomb's destructive force, but with minimal military presence to demonstrate its pure power. At dawn on that fateful morning, the Enola Gay took off from Tinian's North Field, escorted by 2 observation planes. Inside, the crew sat quietly, each man lost in thought. Some prayed, others focused on their tasks, trying to push away the enormity of what they carried. Hours later, as the bomber approached Japan, radar showed clear skies. Below, Hiroshima glimmered in the morning light, peaceful, unsuspecting. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Major Thomas Farabee released the bomb. It fell for 43 seconds before detonating 1,900 feet above the city. In that moment, time seemed to stop. The explosion released energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The temperature at the center of the blast reached several million degrees. The light was so bright that people miles away described it as the sun exploding at ground level. Buildings evaporated. Steel melted. People closest to the blast simply ceased to exist, vaporized in an instant. Their shadows burned into concrete walls. Within seconds, Hiroshima became a firestorm. The pressure wave flattened everything within 2 miles. Those who survived the initial blast found themselves surrounded by flames and falling debris. One survivor, a young woman named Keiko Ogura, would later recall, "I looked around, and there were no houses, no trees, nothing. Just fire and smoke. I couldn't even tell where I was standing. Everything was gone." In the hours that followed, a black rain began to fall, thick with radioactive ash and soot. It stained the skin and filled the lungs of those still alive. Many who survived the blast would later die of radiation sickness, a new and terrifying form of death no one had seen before. Yet, even as Hiroshima burned, the world outside Japan had no idea what had just happened. The American government released only a brief statement. "A powerful new weapon has been used against Japan." In Washington, President Truman addressed the nation, announcing that the United States had harnessed the power of the universe, a weapon to shorten the agony of war. But not everyone in his circle felt triumph. Oppenheimer, upon hearing the news, was silent. Later, he recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The world stood on the edge of a new reality, but Japan still had not surrendered. Even after Hiroshima's destruction, Japan's War Council remained divided. Some leaders believed the Americans could not possibly have more than one such weapon. Others urged surrender, arguing that to continue fighting was madness. But the emperor's government hesitated, uncertain, unwilling to yield. And so, 3 days later, the United States prepared to strike again. The second target was supposed to be Kokura, but when the bomber arrived, heavy cloud cover obscured the city. The crew diverted to their secondary target, Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, the bomb named Fat Man fell. Its yield was even greater than the first. Nagasaki was a city of valleys and hills, and its geography somewhat contained the blast, but the destruction was still unimaginable. Tens of thousands died instantly. Hospitals were obliterated, temples leveled, and entire neighborhoods erased from the map. For days, survivors wandered among the ruins, searching for water, for food, for loved ones, often finding only ashes. By August 15th, the Emperor of Japan made an unprecedented announcement. His voice, trembling yet resolute, reached a devastated nation through crackling radio speakers. Japan would surrender. For the first time in history, a monarch told his people they must endure the unendurable. The war was over. But peace did not bring relief, only questions. Had it been necessary? Could Japan have surrendered without the bomb? And what had humanity unleashed upon itself? Across the world, scientists who had built the bomb were tormented by guilt and awe. Some defended it as a necessary evil. Others saw it as the beginning of an age of perpetual fear. In the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors, the hibakusha, carried the invisible scars for decades. Their stories, whispered across generations, became reminders of what happens when technology outpaces humanity's wisdom. And yet, the race did not stop. The atomic bomb, once a secret known only to a handful, became the foundation of a new world order, one built not on peace, but on deterrence. The United States had ended one war, but had unknowingly begun another. The Cold War had started in the silence after the blast. As the ashes settled over Japan, a new kind of arms race began, one not fought in trenches or skies, but in laboratories and missile silos. And so the question remains, one that echoes even today. When the world learned to split the atom, did we also split our own conscience? In the days following Japan's surrender, the world celebrated in the streets. Flags waved, horns blared, soldiers kissed strangers, and newspapers declared the end of the most devastating conflict in human history. Yet even as victory bells rang, the conscience of the world was not at ease. The atomic bomb had ended the war, yes, but at a price that humanity could barely comprehend. Reports from Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to surface slowly, through censored photographs and fragmented testimonies. Even the American public, who had endured years of brutal warfare, was stunned by what they saw. Entire cities reduced to ash, thousands of bodies charred beyond recognition, and survivors suffering from strange, invisible illnesses. Radiation poisoning was something new, a silent killer that lingered long after the explosion. Victims who had seemed uninjured began to collapse days or weeks later. Their hair fell out, their skin turned black, and internal bleeding slowly consumed them. Doctors were helpless. No one had ever seen such symptoms before. For the survivors, life became a cycle of pain, memory, and stigma. Many were shunned by their communities, labeled as contaminated. Women who survived were often unable to marry for fear they would bear deformed children. Men who lived through the blasts faced years of illness, guilt, and despair. The human cost was staggering, and yet the political world moved on quickly. In Washington, President Truman defended his decision with unwavering confidence. He argued that the bomb had saved countless American lives and forced Japan's surrender without an invasion. To him, it had been a necessary act of war. The final blow, he said, to bring peace to the world. But not everyone in his circle agreed. Even within the military, some questioned whether Japan might have surrendered without the bomb.
Intelligence reports later revealed that Japan's leaders were already exploring ways to negotiate peace through intermediaries. The Soviet entry into the war, announced just hours before Nagasaki, had also pushed Japan closer to surrender. Still, Truman and his advisors believed the bomb demonstrated America's supremacy at a crucial moment. The message was clear. The United States now possessed a weapon so powerful that no nation could challenge it. And somewhere in the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin heard that message loud and clear. The balance of power had shifted. While the world was still mourning the dead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Stalin ordered his scientists to begin developing their own atomic bomb. Thus began a new kind of war, not fought with bullets or tanks, but with fear and secrecy. The Cold War had officially been born. Meanwhile, back in Japan, the survivors struggled to rebuild their shattered cities. Hiroshima was nothing but a field of rubble and twisted metal. In the heart of the devastation, a single structure, the dome of the Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, remained standing, a haunting skeleton against the sky. It would later become known as the Atomic Bomb Dome, a symbol of destruction and survival. The Japanese government, overwhelmed by the scale of suffering, could do little to help. Food was scarce, water was poisoned, hospitals were destroyed. The few doctors who remained worked with whatever they could salvage. Many were survivors themselves, their own bodies weakened by radiation. Foreign correspondents who arrived in the months after the bombing described scenes beyond imagination. One journalist wrote, "It is as if a great hand of fire had pressed down on the city and erased it." But even amid the ruins, life began to stir. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Hibakusha, refused to vanish quietly into history. They rebuilt, slowly, brick by brick, carrying their trauma with them. Their resilience became a quiet act of defiance, a statement that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, humanity endures. Across the Pacific, scientists of the Manhattan Project were beginning to confront the consequences of their creation. In secret meetings and private letters, they debated what they had done. Some felt pride in ending the war. Others were haunted by the thought that they had opened Pandora's box. Robert Oppenheimer, their leader, became a man tormented by his own genius. He argued that the world must now control nuclear weapons before they destroyed civilization, but his pleas fell on deaf ears. The military and political establishment saw only strategic advantage, not moral danger. Within a few years, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. The monopoly America had hoped to maintain was gone. What followed was an arms race unlike anything in history. Both superpowers began to build bombs, bigger, deadlier, more efficient. The logic was chilling. If one side could guarantee total destruction of the other, neither would dare to strike first. It was called Mutually Assured Destruction, MAD, an acronym that perfectly captured its essence. But long before that doctrine was coined, the seeds were sown in the ashes of Hiroshima. For the people of Japan, the psychological scars ran deep. The emperor's surrender had been a moment of shock. The idea of divine authority submitting to a foreign enemy was unthinkable. Yet the sight of their cities obliterated by a single weapon left no room for denial. In the years that followed, Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols, not just of Japan's defeat, but of humanity's capacity for both genius and cruelty. American occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, imposed strict censorship. Photographs of the bombed cities were banned. The true horror of the atomic bomb was hidden from the world's eyes. But truth has a way of finding its voice. Japanese filmmakers, artists, and writers began to document the aftermath in secret. One of the first survivors to speak publicly, Dr. Michihiko Hachiya, described the scenes at the Hiroshima Communications Hospital where he worked. His diary painted a picture of chaos, patients lying in corridors, skin peeling, eyes swollen shut, and the smell of burned flesh thick in the air. Another survivor, Shigeko Sasamori, a young girl at the time, would later travel the world to share her story. Her face had been badly burned, but her spirit remained unbroken. "I was angry," she said, "not at America, but at war itself." These testimonies became the moral heartbeat of Hiroshima, a city determined not only to rebuild but to remember. In the United States, however, the narrative was different. The bomb was seen as a triumph of science, a necessary measure to save lives and restore peace. Public opinion overwhelmingly supported Truman's decision. To many Americans, the bomb had ended a nightmare that had claimed millions. It wasn't until years later, when declassified reports and survivor accounts became widely known, that public sentiment began to shift. Historians debated endlessly. Was it military necessity or moral catastrophe? Yet the truth remains tangled in the fog of history. The bomb did end the war, but it also began a century defined by nuclear anxiety. Every nation that sought power would chase the same terrible secret. The more the world learned to control the atom, the less control it seemed to have over itself. Meanwhile, Oppenheimer's warnings grew louder. He urged world leaders to establish international control of nuclear energy, to prevent an arms race. But the politics of power and fear were too strong. Within years, he was stripped of his security clearance, accused of being a security risk. The man who helped create the bomb was now cast aside by the very nation that had once celebrated him. And so, the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became not only a story of destruction, but a story of moral reckoning. As the decades passed, the cities transformed. Hiroshima rose from its ashes, its streets rebuilt, its people reborn. Schools reopened, businesses thrived, and new generations grew up playing in parks where once there had been ruins. But the past was never forgotten. In the center of the city stood the Peace Memorial Park, a solemn reminder of what had been lost. Each year, on August 6th, thousands gather there in silence, releasing paper lanterns on the river. Each flame carries a wish that the world might never again see another Hiroshima. In Nagasaki, the bells of Urakami Cathedral, destroyed in the blast, were rebuilt and rang once more. The survivors gathered beneath their echoes, not in anger, but in prayer. Their message was simple but powerful. Never again. And yet, as time moved forward, new threats emerged. The memory of Hiroshima faded from the global conscience. Nations continued to test nuclear weapons in deserts, oceans, and remote islands. The mushroom cloud, once a symbol of horror, became an icon of power. For many, it was easy to forget that behind that cloud were men, women, and children, whose lives had ended in a flash of light. But for those who remembered, the scientists, the soldiers, the survivors, the lesson was clear. The real danger was not the bomb itself, but humanity's willingness to use it. As Oppenheimer once said in his final years, "The atomic bomb made the prospect of future war unendurable. It has led us up those last few steps to the mountain pass, and beyond, there is a different country." That country, the one beyond the mountain pass, is the world we live in now. A world where nations hold enough firepower to destroy themselves many times over. A world where one decision, one misunderstanding, could erase everything humanity has built. And it all began with that single morning in Hiroshima. One bomb, one city, one decision that changed the course of human history. The question that remains, the one that haunts every generation since, is not whether it was justified, but whether we've learned anything from it at all. Because power, once discovered, can never be undiscovered, and knowledge, once used to destroy, always carries the echo of responsibility. The story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki isn't just a lesson from the past, it's a mirror held up to the present and a warning to the future. What will we do the next time humanity stands at the edge of its own creation? In the weeks after Japan's surrender, American occupation forces entered Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What they saw defied comprehension. The once bustling streets were now wastelands of twisted steel, collapsed buildings, and skeletal remains of lives that had ended mid-motion. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to nothing but gray dust. Radiation lingered in the air, invisible and silent. The soldiers who walked through the ruins wore masks and gloves, though no one fully understood what they were protecting themselves from. Scientists and military photographers documented everything they could, capturing images that would later shock the world. Burned corpses lying side by side, survivors whose skin hung in shreds, children with hollow eyes. Yet much of that evidence would be locked away for years. The U.S. government, concerned about public reaction and the potential for moral backlash, classified most of the footage and restricted foreign journalists. The official story focused on victory, not devastation. Back home, the American public saw only sanitized images, a few wide shots of ruined cities, a distant mushroom cloud. It was enough to inspire awe, but not enough to convey horror. For many Americans, the bomb was still an abstract concept. Powerful, yes, but distant, almost unreal. In Japan, however, there was no distance. The survivors, the hibakusha, lived with the aftermath every day. Some lost entire families. Others carried burns that never healed. Many developed cancers and diseases that doctors didn't yet know how to treat. Their suffering, however, became the beginning of something else. Testimony. At first, few wanted to speak. The shame of survival was heavy. In a society that prized endurance and honor, living when so many had died felt almost like betrayal. But slowly voices began to rise. Teachers, doctors, mothers, soldiers, all began to tell their stories, and in their voices emerged a collective plea. Remember this, so it never happens again. Those voices reached beyond Japan. Writers and intellectuals around the world began to grapple with the implications of atomic warfare. The philosopher Bertrand Russell warned that the bomb had altered the nature of man himself. Albert Einstein, whose theories had indirectly made the bomb possible, declared that humanity had changed everything except our way of thinking. Meanwhile, governments raced to harness and expand what had been unleashed. In 1946, the United Nations held its first meetings to discuss control of atomic energy. The world's nations agreed that something must be done to prevent future catastrophe. But agreement ended there. The United States wanted to maintain control of nuclear weapons under international oversight, while the Soviet Union insisted on immediate disarmament before any inspection regime. Neither side trusted the other. The talks collapsed. By 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, and the age of monopoly was over. The Cold War was now a nuclear standoff. Across the globe, fear began to seep into daily life. School children in America practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under their desks as sirens wailed. Governments built fallout shelters. Newspapers ran diagrams explaining how to survive an atomic attack, as though survival were truly possible. But behind those public precautions was something deeper, a collective dread. Humanity had learned for the first time that its own extinction could be self-inflicted. The future no longer belonged to destiny or nature. It was in the hands of men who commanded arsenals capable of ending civilization in an afternoon. Still, for politicians, nuclear weapons became instruments of strategy, not morality. In Washington and Moscow, generals spoke in terms of deterrence, balance, and retaliation. The vocabulary of annihilation became normal. The scientists who had built the first bombs watched this transformation with growing alarm. Oppenheimer became an outspoken advocate for nuclear restraint. Others, like Edward Teller, argued the opposite, that bigger, more powerful bombs were essential for security. Out of that debate emerged the hydrogen bomb, a weapon hundreds of times more destructive than those dropped on Japan. When the United States tested its first H-bomb in 1952, the explosion obliterated an entire Pacific atoll, leaving a crater a mile wide. Within a year, the Soviet Union followed suit. And so, the cycle continued. Each new advance in weaponry made the previous generation obsolete, each test more apocalyptic than the last. Yet amid this race, the memory of Hiroshima and Nagasaki lingered like a shadow. In 1955, the first World Conference against atomic and hydrogen bombs was held in Hiroshima. Survivors stood before international delegates and told their stories. Some spoke through tears, others through silence, holding up photographs of lost families. Their words moved hearts across borders. But politics, again, diluted progress. The Cold War hardened. Propaganda replaced compassion. Each side accused the other of hypocrisy, using peace movements as tools of influence. In the United States, the idea of the bomb as a symbol of national strength persisted. Hollywood produced films portraying atomic energy as both terrifying and heroic. Comic books turned radiation into a source of superpowers. The horror of 1945 was slowly mythologized, its raw pain softened by entertainment. In Japan, though, the wounds remained raw. The hibakusha became activists for peace, but they also carried deep resentment toward their own government, which they felt had led them into disaster through blind nationalism. The emperor's voice of surrender, broadcast across a shattered nation, had sounded almost otherworldly, his words veiled and distant. Many survivors wondered why it had taken 2 atomic bombs for their leaders to accept the inevitable. This moral introspection became central to Japan's post-war identity. The country renounced war in its new constitution, pledging never again to maintain offensive military forces. Yet even that vow was complicated by dependence on American protection. The bomb that had destroyed Japan also became the cornerstone of its security under the U.S. nuclear umbrella. It was a paradox that shaped Japan's politics for generations. A nation victimized by nuclear war, yet protected by it. In Washington, policymakers viewed the bomb as a deterrent, a way to preserve peace through fear. But not everyone shared that faith. Dwight D. Eisenhower, a wartime general turned president, warned in his farewell address of a military-industrial complex, an alliance of power and profit that might one day control the nation's destiny. He had seen how quickly science could be weaponized, and how easily moral questions were buried beneath strategy. And through it all, Hiroshima stood as a silent reminder, a city reborn but never fully healed. Each year, on the anniversary of the bombing, citizens gathered in Peace Memorial Park, They bowed their heads at 8:15 a.m., the exact moment the bomb fell, and listened as the peace bell rang across the river. The names of the dead, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, were read aloud. Children released paper cranes, a tradition inspired by Sadako Sasaki, a young girl who had survived the blast only to die years later from leukemia caused by radiation. Before her death, she folded over 1,000 cranes, believing the act would grant her a wish for health and peace. Her story became a symbol for generations, a reminder that even in tragedy, hope persists. While Hiroshima became a global center for peace advocacy, the world continued to stockpile weapons. Tests in the Pacific, in the deserts of Nevada, in Kazakhstan and elsewhere, filled the atmosphere with radioactive dust. Islanders displaced by tests in the Marshall Islands became modern-day hibakusha, victims of a global addiction to deterrence. By the 1960s, the number of nuclear warheads had grown into the tens of thousands. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world closer than ever to annihilation. For 13 days, humanity held its breath as two superpowers stood on the brink of war. In that moment, the ghosts of Hiroshima whispered again. The crisis ended, narrowly, through negotiation. But the lesson was unmistakable. One mistake, one miscalculation, could erase the planet. It was after this that serious steps toward control began. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1968, aiming to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Yet the very nations who possessed them kept them, arguing that their existence ensured stability. The irony was bitter. Peace through perpetual threat. Still, the memory of 1945 refused to fade. Each new generation returned to Hiroshima to see what humanity was capable of, both in destruction and recovery. By the late 20th century, the narrative of the bomb had split into two parallel truths. In the West, it was still often viewed as a necessary act, the decision that ended the war and saved countless lives. In Japan and across much of the world, it was remembered as an unspeakable tragedy, a moment when morality was sacrificed to expedience. Historians continued to debate, politicians continued to justify, and survivors continued to remind. Yet behind all arguments lies a single fact. No nation, before or since, has ever used a nuclear weapon in war again. Perhaps that restraint, fragile as it may be, is the real legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The power of the atom had revealed something terrifying, but also something profoundly human. The ability to fear our own inventions enough to hold back. In the final years of his life, Robert Oppenheimer reflected on that paradox. He once told a friend,
"The physicists have known sin."
He understood that science could never again exist in isolation from ethics. Every discovery carried within it the potential for both creation and destruction. The world he helped shape continued to evolve. The Cold War eventually thawed, the Soviet Union dissolved. Yet the weapons remained, silent, waiting, like monuments to both genius and folly. In the ruins of Hiroshima, cherry blossoms bloom each spring. Children play along the riverbanks. Tourists walk quietly through the museum, staring at melted bottles, scorched clothing, and a watch frozen at 8:15. Time stopped that morning in 1945, but memory did not. And perhaps that is the most important part of the story. That memory itself has become humanity's last line of defense, because forgetting would mean it could happen again. And as history has shown, the moment we believe something cannot happen again is the moment it becomes possible.
The sky that burned over Hiroshima and Nagasaki still casts its light, not in fire, but in warning. The world changed forever in those seconds, and we are still living in the shadow of that change. When the dust settled over Japan, the rest of the world looked at the smoldering ruins and saw not just the end of a war, but the beginning of a new order. Hiroshima and Nagasaki did more than close the Second World War. They rewrote the rules of power. Every government that mattered understood it. Whoever controlled the atom would control the future. In Washington, the victory was celebrated, but beneath the triumph lay a quiet unease. Harry Truman had authorized the use of the bomb, yet even he admitted later that it was a weapon far more terrible than we ever thought. His advisors quickly realized that what had worked once as a secret project could never again be hidden. Others would build their own. Across the Atlantic, Winston Churchill spoke of an iron curtain descending over Europe. The Soviet Union, though devastated by war, possessed immense scientific talent and espionage networks that had already infiltrated parts of the Manhattan Project. Stalin was furious that the Americans had not shared the weapons' secrets, yet he had no intention of remaining vulnerable. In August 1949, the Soviets detonated their own atomic bomb at Semipalatinsk. The West was stunned. The monopoly had lasted only 4 years. Overnight, the United States and the USSR became two poles of a new planet-sized rivalry, and the Cold War truly began. Each nation framed its actions as defensive. In Washington, strategists called it deterrence. In Moscow, they called it parity. Both sides claimed they wanted peace. Both built enough bombs to destroy the Earth many times over. The world's diplomacy reshaped itself around that invisible balance. Traditional alliances gained nuclear weight. NATO was formed in 1949, tying Western Europe's security to America's nuclear arsenal. In response, the Soviet bloc created the Warsaw Pact. The globe was now divided between two systems that distrusted each other, yet were bound together by a single reality. If one fired, both would die. By the early 1950s, military planners began using a new phrase, mutually assured destruction, or MAD. It was cold, mathematical, and disturbingly logical. Peace would survive only as long as both sides feared annihilation more than victory. The bomb had become not a weapon of war, but a psychological instrument that hovered over every negotiation. In 1952, the United States tested the hydrogen bomb, releasing energy equal to 10 million tons of TNT. A year later, the Soviets answered with their own. The numbers no longer felt human. The scale of destruction had outgrown imagination. Deterrence depended on demonstrating capability, and so both powers tested relentlessly, on atolls, in deserts, in the upper atmosphere, spreading radioactive dust that circled the globe. Yet even amid this escalation, diplomats sought rules to contain madness. In 1955 at Geneva, Eisenhower proposed an open skies policy, allowing mutual aerial inspection to prevent surprise attacks. The Soviets refused. Trust was still impossible. Spies, satellites, and double agents filled the gap. Espionage became the shadow war of the nuclear age. The theft of atomic secrets, real or imagined, sparked purges, trials, and propaganda battles. The Rosenbergs were executed in America for espionage. Soviet scientists worked under military supervision, often in secret cities that did not appear on any map. Each discovery, each test was classified as the future's most dangerous currency. The nuclear age also transformed economics and industry. A vast military-industrial complex emerged. Factories, laboratories, universities, and think tanks, all feeding into the defense budgets of superpowers. Billions flowed into research not for better lives, but for better bombs. Scientists who once chased curiosity now lived under the burden of necessity. By the end of the 1950s, both superpowers possessed intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of striking each other in minutes. The sky itself became part of the battlefield. Sputnik's launch in 1957 terrified the West, not because of the satellite's beep, but because the same rocket could deliver a warhead across the world. Space became the next frontier of competition. Nuclear diplomacy took on new theater. Every summit, every handshake between leaders carried the weight of extinction. The 1960 U-2 incident, when an American spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory, derailed a planned peace conference. Trust was measured in megatons. Then came October 1962, the moment when Hiroshima's shadow almost returned to life. In the Caribbean, Soviet ships carried nuclear missiles toward Cuba. In response, American warships encircled the island. For 13 days the world watched, listening to the tick of the atomic clock. Cities prepared evacuation plans that no one believed would matter. In Moscow and Washington, leaders stared into the abyss. One wrong command could ignite the planet. It ended not with war but with negotiation. The Soviets withdrew their missiles. The United States secretly removed its own from Turkey. The lesson was clear. Communication had saved civilization. The following year, a direct hotline was installed between the White House and the Kremlin, an open wire to prevent misunderstanding. In 1963 came the Partial Test Ban Treaty, prohibiting nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space. It was a small step, but symbolically enormous. The first real acknowledgement by both sides that humanity needed limits. Yet, the arms race continued underground. Each nation built more bombs, newer delivery systems, faster missiles. Britain and France joined the nuclear club. Later, China, India, and others would follow. Proliferation spread like a contagion, each new member claiming deterrence, each increasing global risk. Behind these geopolitical maneuvers lay a quieter revolution. Diplomacy itself evolved. Traditional warfare could no longer achieve total victory without suicide. Therefore, negotiations, back channels, and signaling became the new weapons. Words replaced bullets, but the stakes were the same. The 1970s brought both détente and deception. Treaties like SALT I and SALT II sought to limit the number of launchers, not the number of warheads. The numbers were so vast that limitation still meant thousands of weapons on alert. Intelligence agencies verified compliance through satellite imagery, a new form of diplomacy built on orbital eyes. Meanwhile, smaller nations watched and learned. Israel pursued a secret program in Dimona. India tested in 1974, declaring itself a peaceful nuclear power. Pakistan followed soon after. The dream of exclusivity among the superpowers was gone. Hiroshima's ghost had become global. As arsenals expanded, so did fear of accidents. Computers replaced human hands in missile control systems, but computers could fail. In 1983, a Soviet officer named Stanislav Petrov ignored an alert that suggested incoming American missiles. It was a false alarm. His decision not to retaliate may have saved the world. For once, a single act of skepticism outweighed the logic of deterrence. At the same time, ordinary citizens began demanding change. The anti-nuclear movement grew massive, crossing ideologies and borders. Millions marched in New York, London, Bonn, and Tokyo. Scientists who had once built the weapons now joined calls for disarmament. Hiroshima's survivors were invited to speak before parliaments and universities. Their testimonies transformed statistics into conscience. And yet, even as hope flickered, geopolitics reasserted itself.
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 reignited tensions. The Reagan administration responded with a renewed buildup. Strategic Defense Initiative proposals imagined space-based shields that might make nuclear weapons obsolete or provoke even faster escalation. Each new attempt to end the threat seemed to create new threats. But something was shifting. The sheer cost of maintaining global arsenals was crushing both economies. Behind the slogans, fatigue set in. The idea that endless buildup could guarantee safety was losing credibility. Leaders began to recognize that deterrence without dialogue was merely delayed destruction. By the mid-1980s, a new generation of diplomats and politicians began to ask a daring question. If fear had preserved peace for 40 years, could courage finally replace it? By 1985, the world had lived under the nuclear shadow for 4 decades. Generations had grown up with the quiet awareness that life could end not by nature's hand, but by human decision. Yet within that fear lay an odd stability. The two superpowers had never fought directly, and for many strategists, that absence of total war proved deterrence worked. But peace built on terror is a fragile peace. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House, he inherited both anxiety and opportunity. His rhetoric was fiery. He called the Soviet Union the evil empire. But privately, he dreaded the weapons themselves. Reagan often asked advisors whether a nuclear war could ever be won. None could give a convincing answer. Across the world, Mikhail Gorbachev was rising inside the Soviet system. Young, energetic, and pragmatic, he understood that his country was exhausted. The arms race had drained the economy and isolated the people. Gorbachev's new policies, perestroika, restructuring, and glasnost, openness, sought reform, and that required easing tensions with the West. The first Reagan-Gorbachev meeting in Geneva in 1985 changed the tone of global politics. Two men, ideological opposites, spoke not in slogans but in human terms. Both admitted the absurdity of maintaining arsenals that guaranteed extinction. They began to imagine the unimaginable, reducing, even eliminating, nuclear weapons. The following year in Reykjavik, Iceland, they nearly succeeded. For 2 days, they negotiated face-to-face without aids or scripts. At one point, they considered eliminating all strategic nuclear weapons within a decade. The talks collapsed over disagreements about missile defense research, but the idea had been spoken aloud, and that mattered. Hope, once unthinkable, had entered the conversation. Out of those meetings grew the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty of 1987. For the first time in history, an entire class of nuclear weapons was dismantled. Missiles were destroyed under mutual inspection, their warheads disassembled in plain view of both sides. Cameras replaced paranoia. The world watched two rivals perform an act of unprecedented trust. The late 1980s saw momentum build. Summits in Washington and Moscow reaffirmed cooperation. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, not because of a bomb, but because of courage and exhaustion, the human desire to breathe freely after decades of tension. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, the arms race lost its engine. For a moment it seemed the nuclear age might finally fade into memory. Yet even as stockpiles shrank, the weapons never vanished. The START I treaty limited launchers but left thousands of warheads intact. Former Soviet republics, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, found themselves in possession of nuclear arsenals. Diplomatic efforts transferred them to Russian control, but the world glimpsed a new danger. What happens when empires collapse faster than their bombs? The 1990s introduced another challenge: proliferation without ideology. Nations outside the Cold War order sought deterrence of their own. North Korea pursued covert programs. Pakistan and India tested in 1998, turning regional rivalry into a nuclear standoff. Israel maintained ambiguity. Each justified its decision as defense, but the cumulative effect was fragmentation. The monopoly of fear had become democratic. At the same time, nuclear technology spread for peaceful purposes. Power reactors multiplied, promising cheap energy and modernity. Yet every reactor carried within it the knowledge to build a bomb. Civilian programs became masks for military ambitions. Inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, became the new sentinels of global trust, armed not with weapons but with clipboards and Geiger counters. The world learned that treaties were only as strong as the will to enforce them. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, CTBT, of 1996 aimed to end all nuclear testing, but several key nations never ratified it. Subcritical tests and computer simulations replaced explosions, allowing modernization without violation. Technology had outpaced law. Public attention, meanwhile, drifted. The Cold War was over, and with it, the daily fear of apocalypse. New threats, terrorism, cyber warfare, climate change, occupied headlines. Yet the arsenals remained, silent in silos, guarded by routine and habit. By the turn of the millennium, there were still more than 20,000 warheads on Earth. Then came September 11, 2001, and the fear of nuclear terror re-entered consciousness. If hijacked planes could destroy skyscrapers, what could stolen fissile material do? Governments launched programs to secure loose nuclear stockpiles, to track uranium shipments, to monitor black market networks. The idea of rogue actors replaced superpower confrontation as the nightmare scenario. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq revived debate over preemptive war and weapons of mass destruction. Intelligence failures eroded credibility. Disarmament became political theater. North Korea withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and tested its first bomb 3 years later. Iran pursued enrichment that teetered on the edge of capability. The nuclear age, once bipolar, had become multipolar, complex, unpredictable, and decentralized. Amid this turbulence, disarmament advocates kept Hiroshima's memory alive. Every August 6th, bells still rang in Peace Memorial Park. Survivors, now elderly, spoke to students and diplomats. They reminded the world that nuclear policy was not only strategy but morality. Their message transcended nations. Survival cannot depend on luck forever. The 2010s brought modest progress. The New START Treaty between the United States and Russia capped deployed warheads at levels unseen since the 1960s. Global stockpiles dropped below 10,000. Yet modernization projects continued on both sides. Each new missile was more accurate. Each warhead smaller, yet deadlier. The logic of deterrence had evolved, not disappeared. Other powers adapted in their own ways. China expanded its arsenal quietly, focusing on survivability rather than quantity. India and Pakistan refined delivery systems, engaging in their own miniature arms race. North Korea's tests grew bolder, each explosion larger than the last. Diplomats oscillated between sanctions and summits, between threats and photo opportunities, while the weapons themselves multiplied. Meanwhile, a movement emerged that challenged the very premise of deterrence. The International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, argued that legality and morality must converge. Their efforts led to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, adopted by the United Nations in 2017. Many nuclear states refused to sign, calling it unrealistic. Yet the treaty's existence marked a shift. A moral majority had declared that the bomb was not a protector but a peril. As the 21st century advanced, a paradox deepened. The longer nuclear weapons existed without being used, the more normal they seemed. Generations who had never practiced duck and cover drills grew detached from the fear that had restrained their predecessors. Historians warned that complacency might prove as dangerous as aggression. In Washington and Moscow, diplomacy cooled again. Treaties frayed. Verification regimes expired. When the INF Treaty collapsed in 2019, new intermediate missiles appeared within months. Emerging technologies, hypersonic vehicles, autonomous drones, cyber warfare, blurred lines between offense and defense. The old logic of mutual deterrence struggled to adapt to a digital world. Yet through every crisis, one constant remained: memory. Hiroshima and Nagasaki continued to stand not only as symbols of tragedy, but as reference points in every debate. Whenever tension rose, between India and Pakistan, the Koreas,
NATO and Russia, leaders invoked 1945 as a boundary not to be crossed. The fear of repeating that dawn kept the night intact. The global aftermath of the bomb, then, is not only political but existential. It redefined sovereignty, forcing nations to think of humanity as a single, fragile system. Borders lost meaning when one missile could leap oceans. Survival became collective, whether leaders admitted it or not. In private, many diplomats confess the same quiet truth: nuclear weapons are impossible to uninvent. The challenge, therefore, is not elimination alone, but eternal management, a responsibility passed from one generation to the next, like a dangerous inheritance. And still, amid satellite networks and digital command centers, the lesson from 1945 whispers unchanged. Power without restraint is self-destruction disguised as security. The world that followed Hiroshima has built skyscrapers higher, machines smarter, economies richer. Yet beneath all progress lies the same fragile question that haunted Oppenheimer, Truman, and the Hibakusha alike. How long can wisdom restrain capability? No treaty can answer it. Only memory can. The war had ended, but the silence that followed was uneasy. Across oceans and borders, leaders, scientists, and ordinary citizens were left grappling with the same haunting question. What have we done? The atomic bomb had not just defeated Japan. It had rewritten the rules of power itself. As cities like Hiroshima began to rebuild, a new conflict was already emerging. One fought not with armies on the battlefield, but with ideologies and arsenals of unimaginable scale. The United States had become the only nation with nuclear capability. But that monopoly, everyone knew, would not last. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin had already set his own atomic program in motion, even before the smoke over Nagasaki had cleared. He was determined that the Soviet Union would never again be vulnerable to Western power. The seeds of the Cold War were taking root. At first, the world celebrated peace. But beneath the optimism of 1945, the foundations of a new global rivalry were forming, one that would divide the world for nearly half a century. The American government justified the bombings as a necessary act to end the war swiftly and save lives. But in the Kremlin, Stalin read something very different between the lines. To him, the bomb was a warning, not to Japan, but to the Soviet Union. It was a declaration of technological and military superiority, and that realization changed everything. Within months, Soviet intelligence began recruiting spies in Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Cambridge, men and women who believed that no nation should hold such power alone. Their stolen blueprints, whispered secrets, and coded messages would soon erase America's nuclear advantage. By 1949, the world awoke to shocking news.
the Soviet Union had successfully tested its first atomic bomb. The nuclear monopoly was gone. The age of mutual destruction had begun. Suddenly, every nation's safety was tied to another's restraint. Every miscommunication could mean annihilation. Every new invention in physics carried the potential for global catastrophe. And in this strange, fearful balance, the Cold War was born. From Washington to Moscow, the race was no longer to build better tanks or faster planes, but to master the science of apocalypse. In the United States, defense budgets soared. Laboratories that had once developed weapons for victory now became fortresses of secrecy, churning out designs for hydrogen bombs, missile systems, and nuclear submarines. The names Los Alamos and Livermore became synonymous with the cutting edge of destruction. In response, the Soviets poured vast resources into their own program. Their scientists worked under unimaginable pressure. Failure was not an option. Every success was paraded as proof of socialism's strength. Every setback was hidden behind the Iron Curtain. By the mid-1950s, the world's two superpowers possessed enough firepower to destroy humanity many times over. Yet, paradoxically, this very threat became the glue that held peace together. Neither side dared to use their weapons. They had created what strategists would call deterrence, the belief that total destruction would ensure no one ever pulled the trigger. It was a fragile logic, but it worked, for a while. Meanwhile, other nations watched closely. If the atomic bomb could guarantee a nation's survival, who could afford not to have one? Britain, with its long tradition of scientific excellence, was first, then France, then China. Each test sent tremors across the geopolitical landscape. The nuclear club was growing. Every detonation deepened humanity's paradox, the pursuit of security through the tools of annihilation. The world began to live under a shadow, invisible, omnipresent, and eternal. People built bomb shelters in their backyards. School children practiced duck-and-cover drills, as if a wooden desk could protect them from 1,000 suns. Even art and culture absorbed the tension. Novels, films, and music reflected a generation haunted by a single terrifying image: the mushroom cloud. In Washington, President Eisenhower tried to reframe the conversation. In 1953, he delivered his famous Atoms for Peace speech at the United Nations, proposing that nuclear energy could be turned toward progress rather than destruction. The idea sparked hope, but also irony. The same science that powered bombs now promised electricity, medicine, and space exploration. Humanity was trying to balance on the knife's edge of technology, using fire without being consumed by it. By the early 1960s, the rivalry reached a fever pitch. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world closer to nuclear war than ever before. For 13 days, humanity held its breath. American reconnaissance photos revealed Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba just 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy's advisors debated: invade, strike, or negotiate. One wrong move could ignite a war that would end civilization itself. Through a tense series of back-channel communications, both sides finally stepped back from the brink. The Soviets agreed to remove the missiles. In return, the U.S. quietly withdrew its own from Turkey. The crisis passed, but it left scars. For the first time, both superpowers truly grasped what Hiroshima had meant. Not just destruction, but extinction. After Cuba, diplomacy became the new weapon. Treaties like the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963 and later the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968 sought to contain the arms race. Inspectors, Verification systems and watchdog agencies tried to keep humanity from sleepwalking into oblivion. But the genie was out of the bottle. Even as leaders signed papers pledging restraint, the race continued underground. Weapons became smaller, deadlier, more precise. Submarines roamed the oceans with enough firepower to end life in minutes. Satellites watched for signs of launch, ready to unleash retaliation before the first missile even landed. Humanity had created a machine too vast to control, a chain of command balanced on fear. The atomic age was no longer a headline. It was reality. And the question everyone asked, from Tokyo to New York to Moscow, was simple. What happens if the fear fades? The 1970s marked a turning point, not an end to the nuclear age, but a grim maturity. The superpowers had lived for decades under the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the idea that launching a nuclear strike meant signing your own death warrant. It was terrifying, but strangely, it worked. Through that logic of doom, peace endured, uneasy but real. For the first time in history, fear itself had become the guarantor of civilization. Yet even as diplomats shook hands and signed treaties, the arms race continued to evolve. New technologies blurred the line between defense and offense. Multiple warhead missiles, laser-guided systems, and early warning satellites transformed the nuclear standoff into something almost mechanical. A world where machines watched over humanity, ready to respond faster than human reason ever could. It was a chilling thought that one false alarm, one computer glitch, could unleash a war no one intended. And in 1983, that almost happened. In the dark hours of September 26th, deep inside a Soviet command bunker near Moscow, a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov faced an impossible decision. The alarms had gone off. Satellites were reporting multiple U.S. missile launches headed for the Soviet Union. The screens screamed confirmation. The computers agreed. The protocols were clear. He was to report the launch immediately, triggering a retaliatory strike that would end the world. But something didn't feel right. Petrov hesitated. He waited. Minutes passed. No missiles came. It was a false alarm, a glitch caused by sunlight reflecting off clouds. His decision to not report it had quietly saved the world from annihilation. History would barely remember his name, but in that moment, one man's doubt had preserved the balance that millions of weapons depended on. That was the nuclear paradox. Peace balanced not on strength, but on restraint. Meanwhile, outside the corridors of power, the world was changing. Protests erupted across cities, London, Tokyo, New York, demanding disarmament. Ordinary citizens had grown tired of living in the shadow of annihilation. Artists, musicians, and scientists began to speak out. Peace movements gained strength, fueled by the same human conscience that had been awakened in Hiroshima decades earlier. Television brought the bomb's reality into living rooms. Documentaries showing the charred ruins, survivor testimonies, and the haunting silence of Ground Zero. People began asking not just how the bomb worked, but why it existed at all. Then, in 1986, another explosion shook the world, not from war, but from human error. Chernobyl. When a reactor in the Soviet Union melted down, the nightmare of radiation became real again. Silent, invisible, unstoppable. Entire towns were evacuated. Forests turned red with death. The same invisible force that had leveled Hiroshima was now poisoning Europe, not through malice, but through mismanagement. The message was unmistakable. The nuclear age was too powerful for perfection. Even peace could go wrong. By the late 1980s, the Cold War began to thaw. Leaders like Reagan and Gorbachev met face to face, once enemies, now aware that neither side could win a nuclear war. In 1987, they signed the INF Treaty, eliminating entire classes of nuclear weapons. For the first time, superpowers didn't just limit arms, they destroyed them. The sight of warheads being dismantled, missiles cut into scrap, became a symbol of hope. People dared to believe the nuclear age might finally fade into history. And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the world seemed to exhale. The threat, it seemed, had passed. But the truth was more complicated. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, so too did its control over a vast nuclear arsenal. Suddenly, thousands of warheads, bombs, and reactors were scattered across newly independent republics. Who would guard them? Who would control them? And what if some fell into the wrong hands? Western nations rushed to secure the weapons through programs like None Lugar, a quiet race not to build bombs, but to find and dismantle them. It was the most dangerous cleanup operation in human history. In underground bunkers, scientists welded shut silos that once held apocalypse. In secret train convoys, uranium was shipped under guard across continents. In forgotten cities, old warheads were dismantled by men who once built them. For a brief moment, humanity seemed to be closing the door on its most dangerous creation. But that door never quite shut. The 21st century brought new fears. The old rivalry between the US and Russia gave way to a more fragmented world, one where smaller nations sought nuclear weapons not for dominance, but survival. India and Pakistan tested bombs within weeks of each other in 1998, sparking a new regional arms race. North Korea defied global pressure and developed its own arsenal. Iran pursued enrichment programs, claiming peaceful intent but drawing suspicion worldwide. The bomb had become the ultimate symbol of sovereignty, a ticket to be taken seriously on the world stage. Every new detonation echoed Hiroshima's legacy, a reminder that the weapon that ended one war had given birth to endless insecurity. And as technology advanced, so did the danger. Cyber warfare introduced new uncertainties. What if a system was hacked? What if an automated alert couldn't be trusted? The world had built its survival on machines, and those machines were no longer infallible. Yet even in this dangerous balance, hope persisted. Global treaties continued. The START agreements, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and countless international efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear arms. Activists, historians, and survivors, especially the hibakusha of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, dedicated their lives to reminding humanity of what those weapons truly mean. Each year, as the peace bell tolls in Hiroshima, the same wish echoes across generations: never again. But deep down the question remains, can humanity truly let go of its deadliest creation? Because even today, thousands of warheads remain armed, buried beneath oceans and mountains, waiting in silence. The hands that control them are steadier now, perhaps wiser, but the risk has never completely vanished. One error, one escalation, one misunderstanding could still ignite what Truman once called the fire of the sun. The atomic age never really ended. It only grew quieter. The 21st century inherited the bomb, but not the certainty that once came with it. In the beginning, nuclear weapons were seen as tools of victory. Later, they became instruments of deterrence. Now, they exist as a paradox, relics of an age when fear was mistaken for peace. Yet, the story of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is more than the story of two cities destroyed.
It is the story of a species confronting itself. When the bombs fell, humanity glimpsed its own extinction. For the first time, people understood that war could end not just nations, but existence itself. That realization reshaped everything, from politics to philosophy, from science to spirituality. In the ashes of Hiroshima, a new kind of faith was born, not in gods or ideologies, but in survival. Religions reinterpreted the meaning of creation and destruction. Writers and artists began exploring questions no one had asked before. What does it mean to be human in an age when humanity can erase itself? What is progress if its ultimate product is annihilation? Albert Camus called Hiroshima a new era of responsibility. Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein together wrote the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, warning that the choice before mankind was stark: the end of the human race or the renunciation of war. Their words inspired the Pugwash conferences, meetings where scientists from rival nations met not to build bombs, but to prevent their use. Science had created the weapon. Now it was trying to redeem itself. In Japan, survivors, the hibakusha, carried the memory forward. Their testimonies became living history. They spoke not with bitterness, but with the clarity of witnesses who had seen the unimaginable. Children born after the war learned their stories in classrooms. Visitors from around the world walked the Peace Memorial Park, where every stone seems to whisper a single message: remember. Each August, as the anniversary of the bombing approaches, the city fills with light, not from fire, but from lanterns drifting across the river. Each one bears a name, a prayer, a memory. Together they form a constellation of hope, floating where shadows once fell. But memory alone is not enough. Every generation must decide anew what it wants to do with this power. The question is no longer, can we destroy the world? It's, will we choose not to? And the answer lies not in governments or generals, but in awareness. Today, school children study Hiroshima not just as history, but as warning. Scientists speak openly about ethics. Even filmmakers and storytellers carry part of the burden, reminding millions that peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of understanding. In many ways, the bomb forced humanity to grow up. It exposed the illusion that progress is always good, that knowledge is always safe. It made nations realize that power without wisdom is self-destruction. And yet, it also united the world in a shared vulnerability. No matter where you live, no matter what flag you salute, the flash of a nuclear explosion would blind us all the same. For the first time, the survival of each depended on the restraint of all. That awareness, fragile and incomplete, became the foundation of modern global cooperation. The United Nations, international law, disarmament treaties, and the global conversation about peace. They are imperfect, often ignored, sometimes manipulated. But they exist because humanity glimpsed its own extinction and chose, however haltingly, to step back from the brink. Still, the legacy of Hiroshima remains unfinished. In every generation there are new leaders, new weapons, new justifications. Technology races ahead: hypersonic missiles, artificial intelligence, quantum encryption, while the old lesson waits patiently in the ruins of a Japanese city. No invention is beyond moral consequence. Hiroshima reminds us that science and conscience must evolve together, or not at all. When you walk through the Peace Memorial Museum, you find artifacts too ordinary to belong to history. A child's tricycle, a lunchbox, a school uniform fused with glass. They are small, silent testimonies to what happens when war forgets its limits. And as you stand there, Surrounded by these quiet relics, you realize the true measure of power is not what humanity can destroy, but what it can preserve. Perhaps that is the real ending of this story. Not the blast, not the mushroom cloud, not even the treaties that followed, but the enduring question that echoes through time. Now that we hold the power to end ourselves, how will we choose to live? The answer is still being written, in policies, in classrooms, in stories like this one. Because Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just moments in 1945. They were mirrors held up to humanity, and every generation must dare to look again.